Yeah, lovely. All right, I'll get started. Yeah, thank you for that introduction, Sasha. Yeah, as Sasha mentioned, I've been doing debating a little while now. The reason I wanted to do a seminar on whip speeches particularly is two things. Firstly, I hadn't done whip speeches until the start of my World's Run last year. So I'd mostly been a substantive speaker and done a little bit of responsive, but I sort of taught myself how to do whip over the course of the second half of last year. So I've done, I like it a lot. I think it's now my favorite position, but hopefully my thoughts about how to get better at whip and improve at it are useful. And secondly, I think it's the most fun position in debating. I think it's the trickiest one because there's a lot of stuff that people aren't used to or that you might not be used to if you come from other formats, but I think it's the most fun position in debating as well. So, there we go. The way I structure this seminar is I've got three parts. Firstly, I'm going to explain the various roles you have to do at whip. So sort of a explanation of all of the stuff that you're required to do, specifically on the extensions, on rebutting the opposition bench, and on weighing against other teams. Secondly, I'll explain how you can put all of those roles together into a structure. I'll talk about what the kind of classic best practice structure is, and then I'll explain what a kind of better or more fluid structure might be that you should try out. Then thirdly, I'll talk about strategy, and there I'll cover how to sort of prioritize things and how to improve. Generally, in terms of questions, obviously very open to questions. Ideally, sort of at the end of each of those three sections, we'll go over a question, unless it's one of a case of, me saying some debating jargon that doesn't make sense or something that Australians say that other people don't say, in which case just, pop your hand up and I'll re-explain it in a way that makes more sense. All right. So the first thing I want to cover are the series of kind of jobs that you have as a whip speaker. So that's, as you might know, the last two speakers in a BP debate. So there's the government whip speaker, who's the closing government's second speaker, and there's the opposition whip speaker, who's closing opposition's second speaker. And in those whip speeches, when you deliver them, there's a couple different jobs you're going to have to do. The first job relates to your extension, which is the new analysis that your member will have delivered. And I think there's three things you've got to do about the extension. The first thing you want to do is you want to re-explain the extension. And re-explaining an extension is different to just explaining an extension. So explaining an extension is where you go, my member said this, and then you recite all of the things your member said. This is not very useful for the reason that the judge has just listened to your member. So it's not really very useful to just re-explain what they said. But what you do want to do in the re-explaining is you want to quickly cover two important things. The first thing is any kind of deficiency in the way the extension came out. So if you're a whip speaker and you listen to your member give an extension and you notice that there's a problem with an extension, your speech is the time to fix the problem. So some useful things to do, I think, is when your member is speaking, you should listen to what they say and have like a little red line or something where you write down, they didn't prove this or they didn't explain this. You should also, once their speech is done, talk to them and say, did you get to everything? Was there a little bit of the extension at the end of your speech that you didn't really prove? And ideally, if you can, also watch the judge, because sometimes their facial signals will give you a bit of a hint as well. So sometimes, especially if you're in person, a judge might look a bit confused for part of the extension, or they might not seem to know what it is, in which case you might want to re-explain it. Specifically, I think what you're looking out for is, firstly, if there's any kind of framing or impacting around the extension that's confusing. So if your extension is, say, it's some economics debate, and you've got kind of a technical extension that explains something a bit weird about economics, and no one really understands what you're saying, you might want to re-explain it in a kind of simpler way or a way that makes more sense. If your extension has a bit that you didn't prove, so let's say part of the extension requires you to prove a certain claim to show that it's true, and you didn't really give mechanisms for why that's true, or your member gave a mechanism, but they kind of botched the explanation of the mechanism, so it wasn't really clear, you might want to re-explain that. And thirdly, and really importantly, if it seems like your extension is derivative or a knife. So derivative means that your extension seems like it's the same thing that your opening said, so you haven't added anything new. A knife means that your extension is something that your opening said is in tension with your extension. So you're kind of saying something that is the opposite of what they said. In both cases, those things make the extension not really valid. So you want to keep an eye out for, do other people in the debate, or would the judge potentially believe that the extension is a derivative or a knife? In which case, you might want to have a bit of your explanation that says, here's why my extension is derivative, or not a knife. And the thing to remember here is, when you're re-explaining your extension, you want to kind of give new characterization or give new mechanisms. And the judge manual says you can give both new characterization and new mechanisms, but be a little bit judicious about new mechanisms. So it's not really going to be very handy if you give a speech at member and then you get up at whip and give an entire set of whole new mechanisms. It's like you're doing the member speech twice, and you're probably wasting time compared to other things. That's the first thing you might want to do when re-explaining your extension. The other thing you might want to do is you might want to reposition the extension to be more useful against the other teams that are in the debate. So oftentimes your member's going to give a speech which will give the extension, give out your new analysis, but they'll kind of make it seem like it's important in the abstract. So they might get up and the debates, we should ban zoos. And they say something like, well, zoos are good for scientific research. And they just explain why scientific research is important. You might want to make your extension more useful strategically in the round. So for example, you might say, well, our extension is that at CO, scientific research is really good and that protects animals. And opening government's argument is that you should protect animals. So our extension kind of implicitly replies to opening government because it explains why we are better at protecting animals. Or you set up a narrative of a debate where you say, well, this is kind of how the debate has played out. And this is why in the way that the debate has played out, our extension is very handy. And a little bit later in this seminar, we'll hopefully cover some ways to actually kind of reposition the extension. So that's the first kind of job you got to do, right? You got to re-explain what the extension looks like. Your second job is you want to defend the extension against rebuttal that is received. So like any argument in debating, it is ideal if that argument receives some rebuttal. Other teams should, in theory, be giving responses to your extension and saying, this is what is wrong with the extension. Now, in theory, you get rebuttal. In practice, your rebuttal might come from very different sources or might be kind of hard to work out. And that's not a reason not to defend your extension against the rebuttal. Because if the judge is thinking like there's a problem with your extension, you've said the extension member, the judge went, I'm not sure about this. And then there's even a hint of a rebuttal, then oftentimes the judge will say, well, just that one instance of rebuttal is enough for me to go, yep, I don't buy the extension. So the sources that you should look out for are firstly, the speaker right before your speech will sometimes respond to your extension. Often if you are government whip, the opposition member will not respond to your extension because they're busy giving their own extension. But if you're opposition whip, you will usually get some rebuttal from government whip. A second source is points of information that were given to you or to your member. So especially important thing to do is if your member takes a POI and you notice that they don't respond to the POI terribly well, it's very, very useful to think about how can I better explain the response to this POI. Thirdly, and this is a body language thing. Sometimes if you're debating in person, the other speakers in the room will kind of motion that your extension's a knife. Like they'll kind of like pretend to stab their heart or they'll like table tap very aggressively, which is sometimes a symbol that they think you're deriving them and you're saying the same thing they said. That's usually not very persuasive. And I don't think it's very good form. It's a bit impolite. But if people are doing it, it might be a symbol that other people in the debate think your extension is derivative, in which case you might want to know that that's something you're going to resolve. And finally, sometimes other teams' cases implicitly respond to your extension. So earlier in that extension, the debate we took out about banning zoos, if your closing opposition extension is, well, we think there's animal research in zoos, another team's extension or argument about why zoos are run very poorly presumably implicitly responds to yours because it explains that if zoos are run very badly, the scientific research that is done there is unlikely to be very good. So even if people don't explicitly point out that their cases respond to you, their cases may actually respond to you. And so the most important responsive work that you'll do in a whip speech is the defense of the extension. So the rebuttal that is received, you will give counter rebuttal to explain why that rebuttal is wrong. And the reason you should spend the most time here is that it is 3 times as important as any rebuttal you do of another team. Because if you rebut opening opposition, that is only useful in helping you get over opening opposition and maybe a little bit useful in helping you get over opening government if you respond to them better than they did, say. But if you strengthen your extension, then your extension can be used to beat every other team in the debate, right? Every time the judge weighs you against closing or you against the diagonal, that is the other team on the other side, or against your opening team, every time they'll compare against your extension. So the rebuttal you do, the defense you do against your rebuttal is the most important claim you're going to give. Finally, the third thing you can do with your extension is you can weigh it sort of independently or generally. So you may have heard of weighing before, you might not have. It's just a way of explaining that what your extension does is the most important thing in the debate. So the kind of impact that you attain is the most important impact in the debate. So here it would be like scientific research is the most important thing. My general advice with weighing extension is I would pick and justify how you weigh, but I wouldn't worry too much about metrics. So sometimes people teach weighing and they say, well, there's 15 possible metrics. You can weigh on how many people you impact or the scale of your impact or the probability the impact occurs or whatever. And that's all true. But I think the better thing to do is just to say, we think the extension is the most important because, say, it affects the most people. Pick that one, you say, here's why that's the most important thing, like why the thing you should care about in debating is the most important people. Here's why our extension matters more than everyone else's claims. So that's the set of things you have to do around the extension. That's your first job. The second job you've got is your responses to the opposition bench. So as well as giving the extension and defending the extension and weighing it, which is also kind of ultimately what the member has done as well, you want to spend some time responding to the claims made by the opposition bench in the debate. And I think that it's a little bit different when you're responding to closing teams versus responding to opening teams. So when you're responding to the other team in the closing half of the debate, I think it is best practice to always respond to them. Some people would say sometimes closing teams are clearly losing the debate and you should not respond to them. But I think that is impolite. And I think it also is risky because sometimes you're wrong and your understanding of the debate is different to the judge. And if you don't respond to them at all, then you really run the risk that you lose the debate to them. So what can you do in response to them? Any kind of normal rebuttal. So if you're used to giving rebuttal that is, for example, line by line, that is, they say 3 mechanisms, you explain why their first mechanism is wrong, then their second mechanism is wrong, then the third mechanism is wrong. You might do that. Or you might give one really well-proven response. So let's say their extension is proving thing A. You can give one really well-explained response that explains why thing A is not true. Either way, you're trying to spend some time explaining why the extension they give is not true and take them out of the debate. The one thing I'd say, though, is when you are judging them, you should think about if there are any grounds of agreement that you don't want to rebut. So, for example, oftentimes closing half teams kind of come up with a little secret alliance where the top half has talked about one part of the debate and the closing halves both have extensions about a different part of the debate. It is obviously in your interest that both you and the other closing team should run arguments that suggest that the thing you're talking about is more important and the thing that top half is talking about is less important. So you might not want to rebut their material there. Final thing to talk about on closing is you should think about how much time to spend on them. And some useful questions to ask are, A, are they a threat? So is their extension very good? If it's a bad extension, which oftentimes it is because closing is a statistically worse position to be in than opening, you might not want to respond to it. If their extension is oppositional to yours, so let's say you've proved an extension or you're running an extension and the claims they're running are antithetical to yours, they're proving the opposite is true, then you really want to spend time on them because it's kind of like they're rebutting you with their extension. And thirdly, it depends a little bit on whether they're able to rebuild. So things are different if you're government whip and you're responding to opposition members extension, and you might need to spend more time on your rebuttal because you know that opposition whip is going to be around to engage with your rebuttal, than if you're opposition whip and you're rebutting the government CG's extension, in which case they don't have a speaker that can respond to you, so you can maybe spend a little bit less time on it. That, I think, is the easier set of responses. The more difficult set of responses is the responses that you give to your diagonal in a debate. So if you are closing opposition, for example, it is usually useful to do at least a little bit of rebuttal to opening government. The reason that it's not like you're going to go methodically as you do through closing, through every single claim they make, is that sometimes it's not worth doing a lot of rebuttal to them. That is, firstly, if they're not doing very well in the round, you don't really need to spend as much time responding to them, right? So say opening government just clearly get owned by opening opposition, and they don't really have a hope in the debate. It's not really terribly useful to spend a lot of time responding to opening government because they're already not a very important stakeholder. And if you think about what you're ultimately trying to achieve in this speech, you're trying to achieve giving the most useful contributions to the opposition bench. So beating a team that's already down, like kicking a dog that's already down, is not going to be the most useful contribution because it's doing something that you don't need to do. The other question you should ask is how unique are your responses? Because just like how an extension is not useful if it is derivative, because you're saying things that have already been said by the opening team, and therefore you're not contributing to the case, giving a rebuttal that another team already said is also not really useful because that's something that your opening already gave, and therefore the contribution you provided is nil. So if you are going to respond to your diagonal, I would suggest it is not useful to go line by line. So unless there's a really, really important argument that your opening didn't respond to or something, it's pretty unlikely that it's going to be useful to go every single claim that they made in that extension or that argument was wrong. Similarly, it's rarely useful to respond to every argument. So usually they're going to have a very good argument, and you can usually spot the very good argument because it's the one they emphasize, might be the one they use in POIs. It might be one where the claims they make in that argument are necessary for all of the other claims in the case. That argument is probably going to be the one you need to target. And the random argument the Deputy Prime Minister said in the last like 20 seconds of their speech, probably not something you need to target. So when you're targeting that part of the speech, what you want to do is firstly, pick the best argument. Secondly, tell the judge that it's the best argument. So say, the best argument presented by a government bench team is X. And thirdly, potentially, depending on how sneaky you want to be, you might say why the responses your opening gave did not work. So you might say, the best argument given by government bench is this. Opening opposition's response to this was so-and-so. But this response was ineffective because of whatever reason. So you're kind of explaining that your contribution that you're about to provide in rebutting that argument is really important because the claim that was made was very powerful and the response was given by your opening was a bit inept. And then secondly, you're going to explain 2 or 3, or maybe 1 or 4, depending on the situation, kind of devastating rebuttals. And they're going to be new rebuttals. So not going to be rebuttals that your opening said or even tried to prove. It's going to be kind of new problems that you can observe. And one really useful source for this is you can pull out the list of extensions that you wrote up during prep, in your closing prep, and you say, well, some of these extensions kind of implicitly respond to the argument. And those are usually going to be claims that are too complex for your opening to have proven. So they're likely claims that you will still have standing as rebuttals. An example of the way that could happen is in a debate which I was in, which was this house prefers a minimal state, so where like the government doesn't really do very much, to a modern welfare state. The situation as it arrived at opposition whip was that opening government had one top half, and they'd one top half by establishing that the state is a bad thing. So the state intervenes in your lives in ways that are bad and illegitimate. And, they gave a lot of examples of like the US government doing bad stuff and like Chinese government and the Russian government doing very bad things. And they said, well, the state is pretty bad. We'd prefer it if there was not much of a state. And opening opposition had unsuccessfully established that the state, protects us and kind of there's a social contract, but they hadn't done a very good job of it. So in the position that OpWhip gave, the extension given by opposition member was not super good, or it was a good extension. It was well proven. It was explaining why the state is actually kind of good in protecting, but it's risky because the judges might say, well, opening opposition actually proved that fine, in which case it's not a very useful extension. So opposition whip's response to opening government's argument was to spend a lot of time in their speech rebutting opening government's argument by explaining that the counterfactual is more oppressive than the state. So they said something along the lines of opening government's best argument, and the best argument of the government bench, is that the state is doing bad things to people and that is illegitimate. However, there are 3 problems with this. First problem is that the alternative is that you would have, the family or the community be very dominant, and that the family or community is worse. And so this claim comes from an extension. So a theoretical extension that had been discussed in the closing opposition prep was, what if we ran the extension that the family is worse than the state? And, your father or mother dominating you is more bad than the state dominating you. And so the response to opening government is not to go line by line through their principle and say every single claim they said was wrong, because that's not very useful and it's something that opening opposition had already done. The more useful thing to do is to go look at their extension list and look at the kind of clever claims they could run and really prove those in response. And I think that's a really useful thing to do as opposition whip, or as any whip speaker, because when the judges are considering your team's contribution, little individual responses here and there aren't going to stick in their mind as things that you've done, right? If they're trying to draw up a list and they think at the pairwise comparisons, which is how you judge British parliamentary, you judge, did closing opposition beat opening government? Did they beat opening opposition? Did they beat closing government? When they're doing those little pairwise comparisons, the question of did they do useful rebuttal will usually not be resolved by did they say that one really clever response to one really small line. It's going to be, was there a big useful rebuttal that they gave that was really devastating? So that's what you're looking at for in top half. Your final job is the job of weighing against other teams. So the final thing that's happening in whip speech is you're going to say, other teams in this debate, here are my responses to them. Ideally, what you want to do is you want to weigh your extension against those teams. So explain why your extension is more important than the arguments run by other teams in the debate. And as always, I won't go too much into how to do weighing here. You may have already had a seminar on this or have a seminar in the future. But there's a lot of tactics to explain why the claim that you made was the more important claim compared to other people. Maybe your outcome was better, so you affected more people or you affected those people more deeply. Maybe the quality of your proof was better. So maybe your openings argument applied to only a very small sector of the debate, or applied to like people that were a certain way, but not other people. You might respond to that by saying, well, we are more important because we applied to everyone. Or maybe by round dynamics, by which I mean maybe in the debate, there was a really important claim on government bench. And so your extension is very important because it responds to that very important claim. What I would say is when you're weighing against other teams, you want to be very charitable. So you want to take the best possible argument of the other team and take that argument at its best. So let's say opening government made a claim and opening opposition responded to it. You don't want to weigh against the version of opposition your opposition responded to, because the whittled down version after their rebuttal is something that would be attributed to them, right? It's like they beat it because of their rebuttal. But if you can weigh your extension against the best version of their case, even if it survived open opposition's rebuttal, then you're standing alone. You're not relying on opening opposition's rebuttal to win the debate. So that is, helpful in comparing you against your opening. The thing I would say is the trickiest bit is weighing against your opening. So it's kind of easy to weigh against other teams. If you've ever done 3v3 debating, or you've done world schools debating, or any of those formats, in those formats, you get very good at weighing against one other team. But what is new and tricky is explaining why your extension was better than the arguments made by the team that was your opening. So if you're closing government, that's opening government. If you're closing opposition, that's opening opposition. And the tricky thing is to do that in ways that are not knifing your opening. So that are not saying my opening was wrong, or rebutting their extension, or rebutting their argument. Some ways to do that, I think, are firstly, saying what in debated jargon we call logically prior. So saying that your extension proves a claim that is necessary for your opening's arguments. So let's say your opening ran a claim that was reliant on the proof that the government is usually good, and your extension is that the government is usually good. Then you have proven something that opening government needs to exist, and therefore you are more useful than them. Or let's say opening government has been rebutted by other teams in the debate. And other teams in the debate have said, well, actually opening government are reliant on this particular assumption, right? Let's say they assume that people are rational, or they assume that, everyone has a lot of money, right? Their argument might only apply to people that have money. And your argument applies to everyone, whether or not they have money. So your argument is better because it is not just contingent on you believing that many people have money. It applies regardless of how much cash people have. Thirdly, maybe you take on a higher burden. So by that, I mean, you might apply to more of the debate. You might cover more sectors, more people, or maybe your extension is something that's harder to prove. So your opening took the really low hanging fruit that was very easy, and you took the very high burden proof that's hard. Finally, maybe you proved your argument better than your opening. So your opening got a lot of good rebuttal that showed that their argument was very bad. You proved your argument better. One way to make sure you're avoiding knifing your opening in weighing against them is to talk in terms of likelihood. So rather than running arguments and being like, well, my opening's claim was, wrong, it was rebutted, and you start rebutting your opening, which the judge won't listen to, you should rather say things like, my opening's claim is very unlikely because my opening's claim relies on you believing thing X, and it's not really clear that thing X is true. And that's a way to kind of sneak in some rebuttal of your opening without actually rebutting them themselves. You're just using likelihood. Now, in theory, you're going to weigh your extension against everyone in the debate. But in practice, your time is going to be limited because for the last sort of 20-ish minutes, we've talked about a bunch of different jobs you've got to do. And obviously, you can't do all of those jobs in 7 minutes and 15 seconds. So if you're trying to cut down on the weighing time, we'll talk a little bit about how to structure that in a second. But one thing you could do is you could weigh against the concerns of other teams. So let's say everyone in the debate talks about a practical argument, right? Let's say it's something like assisted dying. And the debate is, should we allow euthanasia? And the debate, as it has been set up by opening government, only applies to a very, very small sector of the world, right? Like, let's say they set up a really stringent model for who gets to be allowed to euthanize themselves. And it's people that are really terminally ill, who are very, very late in their life. And it probably is only going to apply to like 5 people in the next 100 years. The practical arguments in this debate are not very important because they only apply to about 5 people. So it doesn't take many resources. The number of people that are affected by them is very low. So if you were a team that had run an extension about the principle, and so, on principle, is it legitimate for the government to allow people to die, or should the government have responsibility to keep them alive? That principle is relatively more important and the way you can weigh it is you can say, well, we talk about the principle, that's good. Everyone else talks about the practical. That is unimportant because it's also marginal and doesn't affect many people. Ergo, our claim is more important than the claims of every other team in the debate. So your weighing is not just against one team in particular, it might be against everyone together. Okay, we're now going to move on to structure and explain how you might put all these jobs together. Before then, though, is there any questions about what we've covered so far? Feel free to like put your hand up or unmute or whatever suits. No.
Okay, if
Alrighty.
everyone is going to ask a question, I actually do have a question.
Oh, you got a question? Yeah, absolutely. Go, Sasha.
Yeah. In terms of when you're dealing with the top half that tries to go for low-hanging fruit and you have a higher burden, usually the way they try to weigh their claims, as far as it goes in my experience, is they try to say that because it's so low-hanging and it's easy to get to, it is also very likely to occur as opposed to a less likely higher burden. Would the way to go about that for you to purely attack the likelihood, or is there something else that you can do in these terms?
Yeah, good question. I guess this is a clever strategy from opening government to deal with it, is to talk about likelihood and say, well, we're very certain. I think the best thing to do in response to those situations is to justify why, well, firstly, try and prove that your claim is likely. But if you're not going to prove that your claim is as likely as theirs, because their thing is certain to happen, like it's, you have to spend a lot of resources doing this, and that's bad. And it's like, definitely they're spending a lot of resources. My advice would be explaining why certainty is not the most important metric in the debate. So actually give a legitimate justification for why the judge should judge the debate according to things other than certainty. So for example, say, well, panel, you say that is, opening government say that this is a very certain argument. But even if there is a 10% chance of our argument occurring, the damage that our argument would show, so the harms that we point to, are so enormous or so important that the risk of it occurring is very low. And it is very important. So, you want to avoid that risk. And one way to explain that to the judge might be to say, here are some examples or some heuristics, right? Like if there was a red button that you could press and it had a 1% chance of blowing up the world, but there was a 100% chance that when you press the button, you got $10. You would never press the button because even if something is very unlikely, people still would prefer to not have the risk of the very, very bad harm. So you can explain something like that just to prove that, certainty isn't everything. There are other important things in the debate. And I think that's just explaining the ways that weighing should work is kind of a useful way to beat other teams. Any other questions? No. All right, we'll move on to structure, which is perhaps the trickier part of this seminar and the bit that hopefully I'll be most useful on. So what we've just explained is a bunch of very, very difficult things to do. So each of those things individually is kind of not that hard, right? It's not that hard to think of what your member said and re-explain it. It's not that hard to rebut one particular team's claim. But what is very difficult is fitting in doing all of those things into a 7-minute, 15-second speech. One option to structure this is what you could call a team-by-team structure. And I think this structure is the best way to learn to do whips. So if you're new to debating, or if you're, like me, a substantive speaker that was sort of starting to learn how to do whip speeches, I would suggest this structure. And the gist of the structure, and I'll give an example of it in a second, is firstly, you say, here's our extension, and you do 3 things. You re-explain the extension. So you might be like, our extension was X. We explained and gave 3 reasons that X was true. Then you might defend the extension. So you might say, well, closing governments say these 3 things in response. The problem with these claims is A, B, and C. And then you weigh the extension. You say, the extension is very important. Obviously, you can shuffle the order there. So some people like to do the weighing first, but generally you're starting with your extension, explaining why it matters. Then you're going to go through the other teams in the debate. And for each of the opposition bench teams, you're going to rebut their claims to a various amount, right? Like if they're closing, you might rebut them more than opening. And you're going to weigh against the contributions they give. And you're going to do that for one of the teams and the other team. And thirdly, you're going to weigh against your opening. And again, you could vary the order you do that in. So you could say, start with your opening, if your opening were doing very well, and spend 3 minutes on them. And then if the diagonal team, so the other opening team, was doing very well, you might spend another minute on them. And then you might very, very briefly cover the other closing half team. Doesn't really matter. The point is, the structure that is easiest to learn is a structure where you go by every team in the debate and you just do what you need to do for that team. And that sounds a bit clunky, and it is a bit clunky. But the reason that it's very good, and that even some of the best speakers in the world do it, and I think it is something that very, very good speakers do, is that it ensures that you're doing everything you need to do very, very clearly. So the judges are never going to get lost and go, what are they doing right now? Or did they respond to so-and-so? and you're never going to forget to do something because you just hit everything you need to do. The other advantage of this is if you're someone that needs more time to write or that struggles a little bit with thinking about how to structure their speeches, this structure takes the work out for you, right? Like you don't have to worry about where do I put this claim versus that claim. You know the structure you're going to do. You know where everything's going to go. So you just need to write out what you're saying and not worry about putting it into an order. So I think that's a good structure. One example of how a team-by-team speech might work was a speech I saw that was delivered on a debate that was about preferring regional or kind of national news outlets. So TV, news shows that are going to cover a particular country or particular part of that country, as opposed to international news outlets. So someone like Al Jazeera or the New York Times. And there was a very good opposition whip speech in this debate that followed that structure. It spent 3 minutes on defending the extension. So the first 3 minutes was on what's the extension? And they started with some weighing. So they said, well, our extension, and their extension was something like international news outlets are better for journalists or something, right? Like it gives them better career certainty. And they're like, well, government bench are talking all about like the quality of media, and the quality of media is kind of symmetric, blah, blah, blah. But our claim is not very symmetric because journalists are really affected. And secondly, they say it's the highest impact. And so this is kind of circling back to your question earlier, Sasha. One thing you might say is, well, the number of journalists in the debate is very low, but the impact on those journalists is high. So they spend some time explaining why the thing you should care about is making sure that the people that are most affected are not affected negatively. Because people that are most affected are the ones that maybe you have more of a responsibility to, or that maybe you should care more about. Secondly, they go, well, government whip rebutted our extension. Let's rebut government whip and explain why the rebuttals that were given to our extension are invalid or not very important in the debate. And thirdly, they outweigh their opening with the extension. And this is a slight cheat on the structure, right? Because if you go back to the structure a second ago, in theory, you were meant to separate out opening, right? And deal with them later. But the reason they did this was strategic. They said opening opposition were not doing very well in the debate, right? They hadn't proved a lot of claims. So you really didn't need to weigh against them independently and spend a bunch of time on their claims. You could just be like, well, we proved an extension and opening opposition don't really prove very much. So we're better than opening opposition. And that one sentence deals with them. Then you deal with the other two teams in the debate. And so you might notice here that 2 minutes and 20 seconds of the speech was spent on response to closing government. And I'm just noticing the times here don't work. Maybe it was 3 minutes 20. My notes might be wrong. Most of the speech was spent on responding to closing government and not very much on opening government. And you might say, well, maybe opening government were terrible, and that's why they didn't respond to them. In reality, opening government were winning, and they didn't respond to them. And we'll talk about why you might do this in a second. But the hint is this was a semi-final. So that's the kind of going to be the reason for it. So they spend 2 minutes and 20 seconds on a closing government, and they say, well, here's how our extension works against your extension. And notice why that's important. It's kind of doing what we said earlier, where we said one way to rebut another team or to weigh against another team is to explain why your extension refutes the claim they make, right? You position your extension by saying, if you believe our extension, you cannot believe their claim. So they do that against CG, and they target their impacting. So the particular rebuttal they give isn't every single claim they say that CG says gets rebutted. They just go, the way that CG impacts their extension is not very important. Finally, they give 1 minute on responding to opening government, and they do the same thing again, where they say, well, opening government's case intersects with closing opposition. Our extension proves why opening government is untrue. So that's structure one. And I would recommend this structure for most people. I think this is the useful structure. I think it's a structure that is very easy. It's very, simple, and many of the best speakers in the world use it. So I don't want you to think that just because it's like formulaic, most people don't do it. Many of the very best people in the world do it. I think, though, it is worth experimenting as you do more debating, especially if you're someone that's kind of doing a bit of it and doing enough of it that you're thinking about your speeches or kind of reflecting on speeches afterwards. It's worth spending some time trying a whip style that is more fluid. And by that, I mean, if you think about all of the stuff I covered back here, so if we go back to the list of stuff you've got to do, the extensions, the responses, and the weighing, each of those things is like a little building block, right? Like imagine it like a Lego block. I assume they have that in Ukraine. They have that in Australia. Imagine like a little Lego block. And like you could stack them in kind of any theoretical permutation, right? They're not literally things that have to go in one order from each other. They're independent jobs that can go anywhere in the speech. And so think about, where can I put each of those building blocks? Like, is there an order that makes more sense? So sometimes one claim that was done somewhere will make more sense put right next to something else very different. A practical example of that might be, Let's say you're doing what I said you should do against the diagonal team, which is you pick their best argument and you rebut it. If your extension also rebuts their argument, right? Like it did what we said earlier, where your extension kind of implicitly responds to their claim. Then what you might want to do is you might want to say, the best argument from opening government was this. There are 3 problems with this argument. And the first 2 are actual rebuttals, right? The first 2 is like a rebuttal you thought of, another rebuttal you thought of. And the third problem is our extension. So the third rebuttal that you give is just you segue into your extension. And you say, our extension was this. It responds to opening government because of this. And then you start defending your extension against rebuttal that's received. And then maybe at the end, you segue from when you're talking about your extension into talking about what your opening said about this theme. So maybe your opening had an argument that's trying to respond to opening government here. And you say, well, opening opposition didn't really work very well. Here's why our extension is more important. That kind of feels like a very niche example. But the idea is, because in a whip speech, you've heard everyone, right? You have all the information about the debate. Unlike any other speaker, you know basically everything that's going to be said. You can move stuff around and deal with it in the order that it makes sense in. And the way some people describe this structure is they talk about it as a structure that goes clash by clash. So, it starts on one clash of the debate and moves on to another, which might be familiar to people that have done 3v3 debating. And it might also be familiar to people that like top halves of debates, like the opening half. Like oftentimes there'll be, a practical clash and a principle clash in the top half. And in a sense, you can think about this as a structure that is based on clashes. So you could think about it as like, first I'm going to talk about the principle. And in the principle, you might start with the best argument from some other team on the principle, some rebuttals, your extension on the principle, then weighing your extension on the principle against what your opening said about the principle, and then doing the same for the practical. The reason, though, that I like to think about it as more fluid than that is that the questions that animate your clashes, so, the question of, is this principally just? What is the practical impact on students, on teachers, can be more broad than just a clash on a particular stakeholder. For example, you could begin a whip speech with 2 minutes on a framing extension. So you could say, well, everyone in this debate is talking about thing A, but thing A is actually not very important. Let me explain why. Let me now explain why we have an extension that, is on something completely different to thing A. And then you spend the rest of your speech talking about thing A. So you begin with something that's not really like a new question or a new clash, but it's just like a framing question, and it lets you bring in an extension. I'll give an example now, and this is, I gave the speech myself, so this is why I remember it. The topic is like that we should establish an international force to arrest those that the International Criminal Court indicts. So in the hypothetical, the ICC has issued an arrest warrant for Vladimir Putin, which it has done, and it would establish an international police force that would go off and arrest Vladimir Putin, or would go off and arrest someone like Omar al-Bashir, who's the Syrian leader, so the Sudanese leader, who was arrested or indicted for war crimes. In this debate, the opposition whip speech is structured around 3 possibilities around how the arrest could be done. So kind of 3 hypotheticals. Hypothetical 1 is, well, what if the ICC makes this body, but they never go out and try and arrest anyone? So they make the police force and they just kind of let it sit idle. In the same way that the United Nations peacekeeping force spent a lot of like the 60s and 70s in existence but idle. And then in the speech you explain, firstly, why this is the most likely outcome. So you say, well, opening opposition, who are winning the debate, have a lot of really good arguments about why this would break the ICC. Ergo, the ICC would never do it because it would be very bad for them. So you do your weighing against opening opposition here and explain why your claim is more important than theirs. And then you talk about your extension. You say, well, we have an extension on this, and here's why it's really important, and let me defend it and weigh it. And then the second option is, well, if the ICC doesn't arrest, so let's say, it goes out and tries to arrest Vladimir Putin, and America and Russia and China all get very scared and they all pull out of the Rome Statute. Or I guess America was never in the Rome Statute, but other countries pull out of the Rome Statute. Then that speaker went, well, bench weighing, so weighing against their opening, here's why our extension here is more important than opening's extension here. And then closing government's argument fit into this hypothetical, right? It sat in this part of the debate. So there you spend some time rebutting closing government. And finally, option 3 might be, well, if the ICC does do arrests and countries don't pull out and everything goes well, in which case you might say, well, opening government have a really good argument here. Let me give some really good rebuttals. And while you're rebutting the opening government argument, you might say, well, opening opposition have very uncharitable responses. We'll be more charitable. And if you think about it, that's almost weighing against opening. So the difference between this speech and a different structure is that whereas this structure went team by team and said, each team is making this claim, let me respond to that claim. This structure is going each question of the debate, which could be a clash or it could be something else, I'm going to try and fit stuff in. And if you look at this, kind of every job ends up getting done, right? You respond to opening government in the end. You respond to closing government in the middle. You weigh against opening opposition at the end and in the first one. And you deliver the extension in the first and the second, and you defend it there. So if in your head, you can keep track of all of those things, you can theoretically move them all around and put them in different places. And it flows much more nicely, right? Rather than weighing your extension and then weighing your extension against each of the other teams independently, you could just weigh your extension against the team that it matters against. And you can kind of do stuff when it makes sense. So I like this structure. This is what I use personally. I think it's worth trying it. And if you are uncomfortable or you're not certain, I would say get good at the basics. So do this team by team structure to get good at knowing how to do each of those claims, how to do the job of defending the extension. And then once you're comfortable doing each of those things, try introducing a little bit of fluidity. So maybe you do what the example I gave on team by team did and move one of the teams, that in that case, opening opposition, into the extension bit. And the next speech you give, you might move two of the teams into a clash and then just deal with one other team separately. And then thirdly, you might, do the clashes all together. And in those cases, I think practicing how you do it sort of makes you, I think, get more used to doing whip speech as kind of a fluid, interesting, technical speech, as opposed to just saying all the stuff you've got to say. Does anyone have any questions on how you might structure the speech? Feel free to just pop your hand up or unmute. It's not that formal. We don't have too many people. Yep. Alrighty, we can save that for the end then. All right, I'll finally talk about a little bit of strategy. And I'll try and talk about stuff that will be useful as you go on. So this stuff might not be as important if, say, you've just started debating or if you're kind of early in your debating career. But as you go on, I think it's useful to kind of think about strategy. And it's also useful, even if you're not very confident, to know what strategies people might be using. So when you watch good debaters give speeches, you might notice, oh, they're doing something weird, right? Like they're not spending a lot of time on some team. Why is that? What are they doing? So I think it's kind of useful to think out the strategy, even if you're not very confident, because it might give you some hints as to how debating works and what everyone else is doing. The thing that is key to the strategy of a whip speech, I think, is prioritization, because I've just described kind of an infinite amount of time that you could spend in a speech. You could spend a long time rebutting any one of the teams. You could spend a long time doing all of the weighing, and you could spend a long time on the extension, right? Like in theory, you could spend 7 minutes because it took your member 7 minutes to say the extension. You could, in theory, spend another 7 minutes just saying the extension again. So the key job is to decide which of those things is more important. And in some debates, you're going to need to spend 5 minutes on the extension, right? Let's say everyone else had really good arguments. You're not going to be able to rebut them very well. And your member kind of botched the extension a bit. But if you fixed up the extension, it would just be the most important thing. In that debate, you really just want to spend 6 minutes on the extension, right? You just want to spend 6 minutes getting it done. And then a really little bit of time on everyone else. In another debate, your extension might just fail, right? It just might not be very good. And you listen to that and you're sitting there with your head in your hands. You're like, this extension has not worked. But if I rebut everyone really well, then I might get us a second or a third based on the rebuttal contributions alone, right? Like the contribution of a whip speaker in rebuttal is, in theory, just as important as the contribution of a member in extension, right? They're both just contributions to your team. So you want to kind of have a vibe for what to do. Some useful questions you might think about when you're answering this is, firstly, ask yourself how well you think each team in the debate is doing. So if a team is doing very well, you might want to spend more time on them or less time on them. We'll talk about that in a second. If they're doing very poorly, you might similarly want to spend usually you want to spend less time on them, right? If they're losing really badly, there's not really much to be gained from like punching down at like a team that's losing. How might you answer the question of how well each team is doing? The first tool you should use is your own tracking. That is, however you like to take notes on what has happened in the debate, you want to kind of have that tracking sheet in front of you and go, okay, was there kind of an unresponded to argument that like really, really matters? But also your intuitions. So notice things like, is another team in the debate derivative or doing a knife? In which case, they're probably not very strong. Like if a team is just saying what their opening is saying, but like in different words, then you know that you can just call that out and be done with it very quickly. Are there contingent claims? So do you notice cases where opening government, for example, is entirely contingent on believing a certain premise is true? If there's a certain thing is true, then opening government are great. If it's not true, opening government are done. In that case, you might think, well, opening government a bit weak. And thirdly, just be aware of the cheap tricks. So in debating, it varies from circuit to circuit. There are sometimes useful heuristics that can kind of help you work out how well the team is doing. So maybe the team is very reppy, which means the team is kind of like famous or people know who they are, in which case the judge might be biased towards them, in which case you might want to spend more time proving that they're bad. Or maybe you notice that the judge is really nodding to a certain speaker, but not to another. And your feeling is that the judge probably likes that speaker, in which case you might want to spend more time explaining why their argument is wrong. Or maybe you just happen to know this judge personally and know that this judge really hates principles, in which case the team that was totally reliant on principle, doesn't matter very much. The second thing you can use to work out how well other teams is doing is your members' opinions. So I think people in debating often kind of forget about their member. Like whip speeches generally have their member like go up, say the extension, and then just like sit down and play like water sort game on their phone for the rest of the debate. But I think this is a waste of a very useful opportunity, which is that your member has probably listened to at least the leaders. They might not listen to the deputies because they're writing, but they'll listen to the leaders and they'll know their own extension. So you can ask your member, well, member, do you think so-and-so, was running a good argument? Do you think the claim that was made at Prime Minister was very important? And their thoughts about who's winning the debate are very useful because if you have two very different thoughts, they can be a bit of a check on your interpretation of the debate. The final thing to think about is, I think you should answer the question of how well other teams are doing with a bit of humility. So people, I think, overestimate their capability to assess how a debate is playing out. So the average debater, I think, is more certain of the result than the result is actually certain, right? Lots of times people go like, wow, the judge just messed up. Like they just gave this terrible call. But actually the call was perfectly reasonable. It was just that this particular debater had a mindset or a personal preference that meant that they didn't think the call was reasonable. So I think it's very dangerous to count someone out. I think it's very, very dangerous to be a closing team and go, okay, well, the threat is, opening opposition and just not respond to the other closing team because they can win, right? This is kind of a little bit what happens to me in Worlds. If you watch the debate, like closing government don't really get response from closing opposition because closing opposition thinks opening opposition is the threat. And it turns out closing government wins. So the kind of humility of knowing that the other teams, what you think about the debate might not be true is very important because I think it means that you don't ever overspend time on one team. The second useful thing to think about when prioritizing your speech is which team your member's speech primarily targeted. So one useful bit of strategy advice that I would give is before your member gets up to give their speech, have a little bit of a conversation about which team they're going to target. So sometimes, for example, a member will spend their whole time talking about opening, right? So let's say your extension is a vertical extension where your opening made a claim. They didn't prove that claim very well. Your extension is explaining that the claim is, explaining the claim better and proving it and filling in the gaps. If you're doing that, it makes sense for your member to spend their speech talking about why your opening sucks, right? Because in order to make the extension sound important, they're going to have to spend a bunch of time being like, our opening made this claim was not made very well, there was a lot of problems with it, therefore that claim is not very important. So in that case, it wouldn't make sense for your whip speech to also spend a lot of time on your opening, right? Because if your whip speech is also talking about the same thing your member speech talked about, you guys will definitely be opening, but you might be totally hopeless against the other teams in the debate. Contrarily, if your member is giving an extension that is the opposite of a claim that the diagonal team gave. So let's say the diagonal team is, it's banned zoos, right? It's that debate we were talking about earlier. And diagonal said, and opening government says, zoos are really good for people's welfare, for animals' welfare. And, zoos are really bad for animal welfare. And closing opposition's claim is on scientific research. You're like, well, we treat the zoos, we help them out very well. In that hypothetical, then it would make sense for your member to spend all of their time rebutting and talking about opening government because your extension and opening government's claims neatly touch on each other. In that case, you should spend more of your time as whip talking about opening opposition or closing government. So have a conversation with a member where you say, what are they saying? What are they focusing on? And how can I focus on the other teams in the debate to resolve that? The final question, I would say, is you should think about what your goal for the round is when you're thinking about what you prioritize. And I think there are three cases where this matters. The first is when you take a strategic second. So this is the resolution to the question I posed earlier about, where was it? It was this debate. Yeah, this debate. I mentioned that opening government are winning, yet opposition whip spends almost no time on opening government, right? They spend 1 minute there. The reason is, if opening government are smashing it out of the park, and you are in a octo-final, a quarterfinal, a semi-final, or any debate where the top two teams progress and the bottom two teams fall out, it does not matter whether you beat opening government, right? It doesn't matter if you get the first. It's fine to get the second. What matters is to make sure that you don't get the third. So if you're a whip speaker in that debate, you might just want to avoid rebutting them altogether. And I think a fun thing to do is if you go back and you watch kind of semi-finals of minis or majors or kind of any weekend competition, if you watch the semi-finals and you just watch the whip speakers, every so often you're going to see a semi-final where the whip speakers don't talk about each other's cases and they only talk about someone else. Or alternatively, let's say opening opposition really clearly won, the whip speakers might just focus on trying to beat each other and not focus on beating opening opposition because they only care about getting a second. So think about whether your goal is to try and, take a strategic second, and then maybe you might want to not contest that clear first. Secondly, if you're in a grand final, or I think there are other situations, any debate where you want to end up with the first and you don't really care what you get except for the first. So let's say it's the last round of the in rounds and you want to break at this competition. And you know that you haven't done super well on day two. So in order to break at this competition, you would need to get the first in the debate. If that is the case, you might want to gun for the winning team. So the two debates I can think of recently, the two World's Grand Finals where a closing team has won, in both instances, the winning team prior to closing government speech was opening opposition. So if you go watch those debates, the speakers in closing government almost exclusively target opening opposition. And so the reason that's important is that it shows that if you are in a position where you only care about getting the first, you just want to annihilate the team that's kind of standing in your way. And then you should probably beat the other teams just by virtue of the fact that you beat the best team. Like it'll kind of help you in those comparisons. Finally, let's say there's a desperate situation in round. So you've done very well at a competition. You're now against like a bunch of really, really good debaters. And you should never give up because when you get against good debaters, because oftentimes they mess up and do stupid things. But let's say they've all run very good cases. And you're like, oh no, I'm definitely going to fourth. If you're going to fourth, you may as well try and get a third, right? Like if you're pretty sure you're going to come last, you may as well try and get third. And in Australian jargon, which I'm trying to introduce to the rest of the world, we call this soliciting the sausage because we think that the one in a 1 point kind of looks like a sausage and a hot dog. And so if you want to solicit the sausage, you might go, okay, I just don't want to come last. So let me pick the team that I think is coming third. And I'm just going to spend so much of my speech, like 5 minutes of my speech, taking out that team that comes third. Even if our extension was derivative and a knife and it lost, I'm just going to rebut that team. And so you might get 1 point because in any competition, it's always useful to have 1 point over having no points, right? It's still going to be matter. It still matters. It still might help you go well. The last thing I want to talk about before we open up to final questions is ways you might improve at being a whip speaker. The first thing is, obviously, as always, the best practice is to do things. So if you have the availability to go to a competition, I think going to a competition is really good. I know it's like a time investment to spend a weekend at a competition, but oftentimes the amount of debating you get to do, the amount of thinking about debating you get to do is more than worth it. Secondly, if you are limited in your time, but I think generally if you want to get better at them, I would think critically about the whip speeches that you have delivered. So think and ask yourself, is there a certain part of this speech where I was really cooking? Is there a certain part where I was doing a very good job and I proved a bunch of things that I wasn't certain about? And I wasn't really sure I'd be able to prove that, and I did. If so, look at the way you proved them. Was there something you did that made it better? Similarly, if there's a bit that you didn't get to, you might say, well, why didn't I get to it? And similarly, I think if you're nervous about trying out more fluid or interesting structures that are a bit more technical, you might give a speech according to the team-by-team structure, and then later on listen back to recording the speech and say, how could I have moved these things around and made it work better? The third thing I think that would help you improve at whip is watching some very good whip speeches. So either that means, if you go to a competition, I would always say you should stick around and watch the grand final, just because, even if you're not in it, just because it's, good practice to watch good debaters. Or if you can't do that thing, or you don't happen to be in a city where there's a lot of debates on, you might be able to watch recorded ones online. And take note of firstly, the timing of the speeches. So when I watch a whip speech, the most important thing I do is I have a little timer on my phone and I track how long they spend on each claim. Because I think it's interesting to think about, why are they spending 7 minutes on this speaker or 4 minutes on this team? Why are they spending that amount of time? And then also think about if there's any quirks you like. So whether you can pick up a strategy of segueing very neatly from a weighing to a rebuttal or something. Some ones that I used a lot when I was training and trying to get better at whip speeches was, there's an Australian bias here. Sophie's op whip speech in the Australian National University Spring 2023 semi-final is very good. This is the one about media debates that I was mentioning. That's this debate. I took notes on that speech. Secondly, Tejas, very famous debater, gave a very good op whip in the Astana Open 2023 quarterfinal. And finally, Matt Toomey gave a very good government whip in the Sydney Mini 2023 semi-final. There are obviously other examples. I'm sure there are many out there, but watch those speeches because if you like them, and say, was there a timing that was good? My final bit of advice before we open up to questions is, a useful tip is to kind of think critically about when during the debate, prior to your speech, you are writing things for your speech or you are listening to the rest of the debate. And I think that that's a very personal thing, because it depends, firstly, on how long it takes you to write something. So if you're a speaker that needs to write things out in full so you can look down and know what you're saying, then you might need to spend more time writing and less time listening to other people. If you're a speaker that can write things super quickly, maybe you want to listen to the entirety of the top half of the debate before you really start writing your speech, so that you can very quickly write your speech, but you also kind of know what's happened in top half. Also, think about how good you are at multitasking. So if you are very good at very good at simultaneously writing down things and listening with one ear out to what's happening, then you might be able to write during more speeches. But if you are bad at that, you should definitely not write during leaders. So you can make sure you know at least what the key case from each leader speech is. And if, as always, if there's a time when you've timed yourself badly and you start writing a speech during leader of opposition and you have nothing to do during government member, and you're like, well, I should have spent more time so I could have listened to leader of opposition. Notice that. On the inverse, if you get to your speech and you haven't written everything down and you're behind and you're panicking, in that case, you probably should have started writing earlier, in which case, think about when you start writing. All right, that's all I've got in the presentation itself. So I'll stop the screen share and open the floor up if anyone has any questions about whip speeches.
Yeah, let me start again, so while people think. I have a question that's a little bit specific, but I think actually it's two questions that are related. One is, the thing that I'm struggling with my whip currently is being sort of very deliberate and explicitly deliberate in terms of explaining why I'm talking about this specific thing rather than another. And the thing that I'm struggling with is that usually I know why that is the case, but I struggle to force myself and or to articulate well why this is something that should beat the other team. Do you have any advice on how to get better at that? And two is a general thing in terms of maybe drills or something that you do outside of the round itself to improve.
Yeah, absolutely. So in the first one, I think that's a very good thing to do. And it's glad you're practicing, I guess, kind of being explicitly deliberate about why one thing is important, not another. My best advice for getting better at that and communicating it in a debate is to build up kind of a narrative in your head of how the debate has worked. So that narrative is the one or two key claims that opening government made, the one or two claims that opening opposition made, ditto for closing government. And that's if you're closing opposition. If you have a kind of idea in your head, a kind of mental map of how everything in the debate is working against each other, closing the opposition's case clashes with the opening government in this regard, so on and so forth, it becomes easier to explain why something you're doing is important. So if you're rebutting a particular claim, you can explain to the judge, this claim was necessary for opening government's two arguments because thing A and thing B. It was also necessary for closing government's argument because it was, kind of a premise of their extension. Plus, opening opposition did not respond well to it. Therefore, if we can prove the opposite of this claim and rebut it well, then that is going to beat opening government and closing government. And it is a useful contribution against opening opposition because we're doing a better job of an important job than they are doing. So my advice is, I think, to be more deliberate kind of storytell about the debate a little bit more. So tell the judge, this is how the debate's played out. This is why this particular claim that I'm about to respond is really important. And I think that plays in a little bit to what I was saying with rebuttal, which is that my advice is always fewer things rebutted better is more important. Because if you can tell that story about one bit of rebuttal and then really, really sell that bit of rebuttal, that's going to be way better than if you don't have time to sell the story about like 10 rebuttals. The other thing I would say on drills, so I think the big one for me was what I said earlier about like recording your speech, listening back to the recorded speech, and think out how you might restructure it. In terms of other drills, I think it's just practicing each of the individual jobs. So ways to drill those things might be like if you're doing a spar or something or practicing against someone, really practice for a spar, listening to your member and write down a list of everything you expect your member to say and go through with a red pen every time they say something badly. So you have a really, really clear image in your head of why their speech was right or wrong, like, the things they've missed. And that then gets you good at that one particular job of re-explaining an extension after your member has done it and filling in the holes they left. So I think the best way to drill is either redoing a whole structure or taking an individual job that you're not very good at and targeting that job in particular. Because I think a whip speech is nothing more, as this presentation hopefully made clear, than an aggregation of other little jobs to do. And you want to kind of get good at each of those individual things. Any other questions? All right, well, thank you all for coming. It's been a real pleasure to give you a speech. And as always, feel free to message me on Facebook or anything if you want more clarity or a recording of this seminar. Thanks, everyone.